You'll recall that a few meetings ago we had Captain Rowell here reminiscing about some of his experiences as an MMA captain. Particularly, does anyone remember Burl Ives?
Yeah.
Singer? Yeah. He used to sing the Foggy Foggy Dune. Yeah. Well, that was what Harold was speaking about, the problems he had with fog at times. Anyway, today he's going to go back before that, maybe not before that, but back to his wartime experiences, and I'm going to warmly welcome Harold to the podium to talk about flying up in the islands in a Boston.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you again. It's suggested that I should talk about Bostons, and I'm happy to do so, but Brian suggested I should start from the beginning. So I should preface it with the fact that I've had a fortunate life and I'm grateful for it. And of course anyone who's been on active service, they wonder why me or why not me. If you know the answer, please let me know. I thought I was a little late in joining the aircrew. Initially my parents didn't approve. I'd given tacit approval to an elder brother to apply for aircrew, but one son was enough. However, I'm a persistent bugger, and I persisted. And one day when both my parents were listening to Winston Churchill at his best, I brought out my application form and had them both sign it. Both. Just in case there were recriminations afterwards. I've always been very conservative. Eventually, I did months on the aircrew reserve, and eventually was called up on 15 course. I thought I was late, as I said, but I was the third youngest in the course of 60 or 70 or so. So I wasn't that late. My first recollections at Aviation Pierce, or my main recollection, was the fact that I was a deputation, or half a deputation of two, complaining to the commanding officer, Brownell, I think that was his name, about the obscenities of the drill sergeant. It was a sort of the beginning of my career of being critical of some aspects of some people's operation. Then on to Cunderdin. I was scrubbed before I got double figures in airline experience. My instructor was Henry Maitland Thomas, a delightful bloke, spoke the same language as I did, was patient and polite and formal. He sent me solo, but I was due for a second solo check, and Henry was to give it to me at 7 o'clock in the morning, but Henry got toothache, and the flight commander, called Cridland, Flight Lieutenant Cridland, had given himself a morning off. He may have had a late night before, and he was upset visually and orally on having to take a bloke of my size out for a second solo check when he had decided he'd have the morning off. I'm not quite sure what happened next, but Henry Maitland Thomas was very meticulous in handing over, taking over all the formalities. I got into the slipstream of one of the 50-odd Tiger Moths taking off, and the flight commander was not happy with it. He stirred the pudding with the with the joystick, and I thought he'd taken over. He thought I still had it. We wandered off the wild blue yonder, and he scrubbed me adjectively at length and told me to get out of his sight. And that was the end of my aviation career, with a total flying experience of less than 10 hours. Thanks to Henry Maitland Thomas, on the way back up the slope from Cunderdin, I was walking up on the right side and down the hill on the other side. Henry Thomas, morning Rowell, morning sir. What are you up to? I've been scrubbed, sir. Who by? The flight commander. Come with me. Not another word spoken. We came back to the flight office. Stand here, wait. About 20 minutes later I heard one voice only. And eventually Henry came out and said, come with me, put on your flying gear. And my scrubbing lasted for about 2 hours, no more. And I went under flying command for almost 40 years, for about 23,000 hours. Such is the good fortune of some, but not all, in the Empire Air Training Scheme. A lot were victims of the flight commanders or others who were not quite so patient as Henry. That was Cunderton, on to Geraldton. Geraldton wasn't that spectacular, only I reminded in this morning's paper the HMAS Sydney sinking was on in November of 1941. I was an observer in the Aviation, trying to find bits and pieces of the Sydney. We went from well north of Geraldton to just north of Carnarvon, out to sea to the maximum of our range, and didn't find a thing. Ironically, perhaps, my wife can't be here today, but she was in Naval Base headquarters in Sydney about 10 months before I'd even met her, and she was deciphering the details of the Sydney sinking, and perhaps was one of the first civilians to know of its sinking in Australia. The other memorable thing about Geraldton was digging slit trenches. I was given a gaggle of trainees, and between the lot of us we were digging slit trenches and filling sandbags with the spoil. Late December 41 I was posted, or told I was posted to Europe. I got down to the embarkation depot at the foot of William Street where the bus terminal is now, and I rotted there for a few weeks. They gave me a £40 overseas kit allowance. I'd just been made an officer. They tried to make me a gentleman, I think. But I spent the money and a little bit beside. But would you believe that bureaucracy was fine and well throughout the war in Australia? They took that overseas kit allowance from me twice and gave it to me 3 times. It was in my pocket when I was discharged, but it was quite embarrassing in the final stage when they put me down to a shilling a day. I'd only been married a few months. We were staying at the Launceston Hotel in Launceston. Quite embarrassing. However, onwards, we had to fill in time. I'm probably one of 200 or 300 pilots who were stopped from going overseas but kept in Australia, and there were no aircraft for us to fly. I did a navigational reconnaissance course at Laverton. The highlight of that, believe it or not, was I think I brought solace and comfort and the thought of safety and happy rest to the captains of the Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary. They were racing through Bass Strait, and I did an anti-sub patrol above them. What I did, or what I would do if I saw a submarine, I'm not quite sure. I'm reminded of the young fella who chased a likely young lady into the woods. She tripped over, he tripped with alongside her, and he yelled out, "Mum, what do I do now?" I don't know what Mum would have told me to do if I'd seen a submarine. But at that time, there was nothing in the Australian Navy available to escort the Queens. And believe it or not, the escort they had was the Dutch Van Tromp and the French Triomphant. How do I know that? My wife told me. after, or the course, in our course, the good blokes, the successful fellows were made lecturers. It was yet another course to occupy the time of pilots. The blokes at the bottom became duty pilot for the various aerodromes that they were making from Corunna in WA across to Charters Towers in Queensland and in between. I was in the middle section and I was sent to the Bombing and Air Gunnery School at Sale to do a Beaufort conversion. There wasn't a great deal of room and the Allied Works Council was still working at Sale, but we joined in and I was converted onto Beauforts. As I recall, we had 5 English-made Beauforts, about 47 Australian-made ones straight off the production line. Our instructors were RAF officers. My particular bloke was a Welshman. He was the essence of patience and understanding, and he sent me solo in a Beaufort in a reasonable time. But I do well remember one time at the bag school, and he said, "Harold, we cheated the Reaper 7 times this afternoon. The US 7 Beauforts. That's enough for one day, let's go and have a drink." And I'm reminded of Brian Hernan's thing of biplanes. As we were turning our backs on the Beaufort, my friend Judge Landry looked. There was a Hawker Demon in the hangar of the bag school, and he said, "Harold, the last real aeroplane." A biplane with struts and wires and the instrument panel that wasn't very cluttered. Judge, of course, or Landry, was much older than I was. From there we went to Bairnsdale for number 1 OTU, Beaufort OTU. It was a mixed bag. The majority of us were Empire training schemes of a similar lack of experience as myself. There were quite some senior RAF fellows as well. And I find in looking at my logbook briefly that I did more time as second pilot in Beaufort doing anti-sub patrols and convoy escort work than I did on OTU. The word went out that we had to have a minimum of 10 hours total at our operational training unit. It's not a great deal. But even with less experience that you would normally get, in that finally to get the 10 hours up, 4 or 5 of us would crowd into a Beaufort. We'd draw straws as to who did the takeoff and landing. The other 2 or 3 would fly low over the lakes at Lake Entrance, etc. And eventually they said, "Which would you prefer to fly, a Beaufighter or a Boston?" At this stage, I don't think any of us had seen or heard of them. So we said, we don't mind which, but let's keep the various pairs together. In the event we were so popular and the posting of such inexperienced people onto Beaufighters or Bostons was an unpopular sign, so every second one went to one and the other to the Bostons, and a few stayed on Beauforts. The Bostons, I might add here, how we got them. The Bostons we had in Australia, the RAF never ordered them, they never paid for them, and we got them by accident. Initially, they were ordered by the French. The Douglas order book was in the name of France. When France capitulated, the Brits took it over. When Japan came into the war, the Brits gave it to the Dutch, and the aircraft were completed to Dutch specifications. 6 of them got to Java, along with all the spares and maintenance equipment. 4 of them got airborne and were shot down. 2 were damaged on the ground. everyone was taken POW. The following 22 aircraft were on the high seas en route from the US to Java. Word got out that Japan was in charge of Java at the time, so they were dumped in Melbourne. And our people did a wonderful job in putting them together. And I might add that anything that a company that was in Dutch and could well have been in double Dutch as far as we were concerned. But I might add they had big orange triangles on them, no sign of a roundel. And of course there's no, well, the RAF had never ordered them and never expected them and had no paperwork on them. We got to, I would think that we had up to 20 or 30 people in the same qualifications as I had, or the lack of them. And I was one of 7 that were prayed to the CO, a fellow called Bell, Dinger of course. And he said, well, you're inexperienced. He's quite right. I don't want you, I don't need you. I've been trying to get rid of you ever since I heard you were coming. And I haven't stopped trying yet. Welcome. So for the next 3 or 4 weeks we weren't allowed to even look at the Boston. The Havilland were churning out tiger moths at Muscat. And I got the job more than once of taking 3 or 4 pilots down to Muscat, and the boys would get out and ferry a tiger moth to Temora or Parkes, or I think to Goulburn once or twice. They'd ferry the aircraft out, I'd go back to lunch at Richmond, and then after lunch I'd go around and pick them up, bring them back to town. So we didn't get near, theoretically we didn't get near Boston. I chummed up with a couple of fellows, or I might add, some Sydney-siders had done their initial training at Bradfield Park. Then they went to Canada and did all their flying there. Then they went across the Atlantic and did a full conversion and OTU on Bostons in England. And went to a Boston squadron in England. Since we got our windfall Bostons, 5 of them were brought back to Australia to show our people how to fly them. But they're all Empire Air Training Scheme, they're all enthusiastic amateurs, and to permanent professionals they could be taught very little by Empire Air Training Scheme people, in Australia at least. But I got alongside a couple of them, and they were very patient and I was persistent. And I learned a little from them, and I illegally sat in the cockpit of Boston as often as I could find an empty cockpit to get an idea of what they felt like from the inside. But that was after a month or 2 of just hanging about, flying about. I flew a moth miner and a tiger moth on Avroance, and the word went out that we would be given Boston training, or at least some of us must be. We lost about 10 or a dozen, or the CO was successful in getting rid of 10 or a dozen of us. And some of us were persistent. And I don't know quite how it happened, but we didn't have any duel, and the Boston was such a docile, delightful, wonderful aircraft that even I could fly it. And it was quite an experience to get into 3,300 horsepower, taxi around the aerodrome to find out just how far above the ground you were, point it into wind, take it off, and then shake your head and get the feel of it and come back. And no one bent a Boston in that area. Sadly, the bow fighters were much more difficult, and my contemporaries who went on to bow fighters were not nearly as fortunate as those of us who went on to Bostons. anyone could fly a Boston. You had to be almost a professional to fly a Beaufighter. But then bureaucracy took up, and I wouldn't want to take over the poet laureate's job. But the squadron song went something like this. I won't sing it, so don't get upset. We would be night fighters, we would be GR, General Reconnaissance. We would have dropped torpedoes, what do they think we are? They didn't think that we should do Army close support work as had been done in North Africa and on the Russian front. But that's what we finished up doing. Perhaps another verse I might be forgiven for remembering it. It goes, Rowell's aeroplane had wings on, and when he flew into a cloud, when he came out bottoms up, he nearly wore a shroud. But that's perhaps for another story. Bostons, we got very little flying with them. We were allowed to fly low anywhere and everywhere. We did a bit of anti-submarine work and convoy escort stuff. And coming to and from that sort of thing, I hit a Pelican once. Must have been flying high. But it wasn't my aircraft, but the flight commander's aircraft, along with the yellow bombs on the side, had a Pelican. I was always wanted to put my name under it. The other thing I remember, once I was flying low along the beach. Eastern beaches are very firm, and as you may know, a lot of traffic, cars, bicycles. This day there's a bicycle pedaling along the beach, and somehow or other I climbed over his back wheel and he went base over apex. And whenever the phone rang when I got back, I dreaded the fact that someone might have broken a leg or got upset with us. One thing I did omit, we went from Bairnsdale, at least from Bag School, sailed to Bairnsdale. The Allied Works Council was still operating there. I was given the job of taking Beaufort down there. And almost the end of our landing run, about 100 or a couple of 100 metres inside the boundary, I went in up to the nacelle on the Port Mica. Allied Works Council came, we filled a ruddy great stump out of there the other day, but we filled it in and raked it over. They didn't compress the ground at all, and we found the hole. But eventually, believe it or not, I was given or allocated a Boston A28-8 DU, D for Dutch, or DU for Dutch, and the squadron letter was J. I just met a young lady in Sydney at the time, and the only time she misled me, I think, was she told me her second Christian name was Jessica. So I called the aircraft Jessica. It transpires later that as a young primary school teacher, at least a primary school student, she convinced the teacher that her second Christian name was Jessica, and not as they had recorded it. The problem was that the elephant at Taronga Park Zoo was also Jessie, so she decided to change her name. It caused quite a bit of trouble when we had savings bank accounts and school certificates in the name of Jessica. However, the squadron, believe it or not, I've got a photograph at home of every member of the squadron with a tin hat on for the leaving Richmond to go to Charters Towers. The only time I think I saw tin hats there, although we always had them in New Guinea. But the squadron went from Richmond to Charters Towers, just west of Townsville. Don't let anyone convince you that there was the possibility of Australia being attacked. We went to Charters Towers to repel the invaders, but they didn't turn up because of Brigadier Potts and his merry men stopped the Japanese just short of Moresby. by this time, most of the fellows with my limited or lack of experience were posted out. At least 2/3 which Mr. Bell was confident or competent in getting rid of us. But I was hard of hearing or some such, and hung on. I got... Someone else took Jessica from me to go to the Charters Towers. Believe it or not, at the tender age of 21, I was in charge of the road convoy of all the transport vehicles of the squadron. I don't recall how many vehicles we had, but we had more than one punt load. Most of the northern rivers in New South Wales didn't have bridges across them, there were punts, so we had a couple of loads of punts at least. I don't know whether I should tell you of my first operation. I got to Moresby late. They gave me back the aircraft. Jessica gave me back at Townsville, but they mucked her about a bit. I had to take her back to Wagga for service, and I got back as far as Amberley, and she needed service again at Wagga. And after that, I had an engine fire on takeoff, and the main wheel blew out after I landed, and so I didn't get to war until late November. But when I got there, Charles Learmont was my flight commander, and he gently told me that I was inexperienced and should go back to Australia for further training. I didn't learn until 20 years later that I was in fact posted south, but nobody told me. I pleaded with Charles to let me have one trip, and he agreed. And so off we went. About half a dozen of us went to attack Rowell. Believe it or not, the Japanese nearly captured Rowell. A 25-pounder was on the end of the strip at Rowell in operation against the Japanese. So they got within a 25-pounder range of the airport. In the debriefing, they said, "Where did your bombs go?" I said, "I've got no idea." And a fellow called Harry Craig, Black Harry, said, "Where did yours go, Charles?" And Charles said, "There." He said, "Well, Junior's went halfway between yours and the target." My mother wouldn't have kissed him, but as a result of that, apparently Charles decided that he wouldn't advise me of my posting. I stayed with the squadron for another 10 months. Most of our work was Army close report work. We had a few experiences there, but I'll skip them until I get an operation out of Goodenough Island. But round Moresby, there was no, I hate the word, but there's no infrastructure. No civilians, no coffee shops, no corner store, no grog shop, no stately manor. Anyone that stayed there was a member of the, or was enlisted in the ANGAR, the Australia and New Guinea Army unit. Even the missionaries were all in uniform. But we had far many more pilots and aircraft, and we weren't very busy flying. But three of us, a group, got to running around native villages, and we did a bit of bartering with them. They quite liked our bully beef and hardtack, and we quite liked their mangoes and pawpaws and pineapple. We also acted as agents for them in flogging their grass skirts and this, that, the other, and as a result of that we did a bit of fishing. Could we have fishing in New Guinea style? My left hand covers what I might have shown otherwise. And the fellow this side of me is Black Harry, Harry Craig. It wasn't normal fishing. The fellow that's bending over is an army bloke, an army lieutenant, and he had a job of blowing up Moresby as one of the last men there before the Japanese took it over. And he had a surplus of gelignite. And dare I admit it, they used to tie 3 sticks of gelignite together, put a fusee in each of them, and light it off. Everyone out into the water, this out onto the boat, throw the gelignite in, and we'd all dive in and catch the fish that was stunned. Fishing New Guinea style. Why I go into the missionary side and our connection with them is that when we shifted to Goodenough Island, the missionaries, fellows that we had befriended, I might add we helped them out occasionally with the odd hinge or bolts or screw or nails or stuff that was hard to get. With the help of our army friend, we could help them a bit. We got a reputation for doing so. He wrote to the Goodenough people missions there. I'll come back to that. But I said earlier there's no infrastructure in Moresby. Our tour of duty in Moresby or New Guinea at that stage was 6 months. You might do 20, 30 or seldom more than 15 or 20 operations in that time. We were very, we outnumbered the pilots or the aircraft at least 2 to 1. But after 6 months we're supposed to have end of operation. We never got any replacements between when the Dutch delivered the windfall ones to us. The squadron never got any replacements in my time, and anecdotes have it that we didn't get any until January 1944. So it was a bit like the 10 green bottles hanging on the wall. We finished up with very few. But every pilot was given 7 days ops leave, short ops leave, 7 days in your capital city. If you came from Brisbane, you're away for about 9 days. If you came from Perth, the traffic people were very cooperative. If you had a distraction in Sydney, you wanted to see what you could tell them you didn't want to get any further than Sydney today, thank you. And next day or 2 or 3 days later you say, well, I don't want to get any further than Melbourne. I had a crewman that was badly injured and he was still in Heidelberg Hospital 3 months later. So I took time off to go and see him. I got to Perth eventually and had my 7 days and queued up to come back east. But traffic was heavy, and even though we had a fairly high priority, I didn't get away. I left home to go to the war again 3 times. The third time I thought, that's enough. I had the third night in the Savoy Hotel. I got away next day. But I couldn't get past Sydney, of course. And while I was away, they shifted from Moresby to Goodenough Island. And I was almost I missed the establishment of the camp at Moresby. I'm being delayed at Wagga, and I missed the establishment of Goodenough by being in Perth. Why I mentioned this really is that Bob Wines and Harry Craig were my particular mates. They were both Sydney-siders, and they both were country people. They'd established themselves in a tent. But the missionaries decided that we were good blokes. They arrived apparently just before I came back from leave with the wherewithal to build a hut. And they built a grass roof hut with half reed walls and timber floor. It was quite big enough for 3. In fact, it was crowded for 2. And Bob and Harry were happy in their tent, so they allowed me to have the hut on my own. Why we mention that? The replacements that the doctor said we had to be replaced by the end of September or he would ground us. So that we had replacements, including a Wing Commander Townsend, He was senior to our Charlie Limot had since gone from flight commander to CO. He was junior to Townsend, but Charlie was still CO. But Townsend turned up in my hut and said, "Out, I'm coming in." And I didn't hear him. Chose not to hear him, but he repeated it rather adjectively. And I said, "Well, I'm posted south within a couple of weeks, and I'll hand it over in good order and condition then, but between now and then I'm staying." And wing commanders, permanent wing commanders, don't like being told by first officers that they're not going to obey them. In the end, rightly or wrongly, I suggested that the grass roof was very dry, and the reed half wall was very dry, and the timber floor was very dry. And whilst I felt it wouldn't catch fire if I was in residence, who knows? And he got a bit red in the face. And one thing. I don't know whether he ever tried to get Charlie Learmont's cooperation in the matter, but I heard nothing from anyone else. But it's significant in that on the 11th of September 1943, they decided a maximum squadron effort would be made against Gasmata. We had a total of 4 serviceable aircraft, 4. And Charles and I had been out once or twice, and he asked me if I wanted to lead it, and I said, would I want to lead the show? And I said, yes, please. So we were briefed on the afternoon of the 11th to go and attack Gasmata. I was to lead it with a new fellow from Adelaide, a fellow called Peter, called Matters Little, Peter Gunson. Peter was my number 2, and Eric Riley, who is the same vintage as me, was to lead the other pair with Harry Dawkins as number 2. And this was all arranged and fixed, and we were to take off to attack first light next morning. At midnight on the 11th, Charles gave up the commanding officer's job, and Townsend was acting CO. He got up bright and early on the 12th with all his rank and ribbons up and altered the order of service. Eric Riley was to be me and be my number 2. Harry Dawkins and Peter Gunson, they were both senior to me. Harry was to lead, Peter was to be his number 2. I know when I can't win, so I don't bother to argue. So that was the order we went out. Got to Gasmata, and Harry went in and he was shot down. Actually, he landed safely into the ocean and got out into his dinghy. Peter got a bit concerned about this, and he didn't come in straight away. I went in next, and I got mucked about a bit in the cockpit. I might add, the first time I'd ever worn Polaroid glasses on any operation, and one of the bullets got into the slab of perspex that was inside the cockpit, inside the windscreen, and the whole lot splintered, and one of the lenses of my Polaroid glasses were broken. All I had to do was flick them off and continue dive bombing. It's a very unfortunate time for those things to happen. Had I not had the Polaroids on, the end might have been different. But sadly, Eric Riley, my number 2, was shot down. He crash landed and burned on the target, and that was that. We got back to Goodenough Island, and I selected gear down. There's no report of other than hits in the cockpit. I might add, they broke a favourite propelling pencil in half alongside me, and I was a bit annoyed about that. But we got back to Moresby and selected the gear down, and we got a one main wheel only down. and the other main wheel was swinging and the nose wheel was swinging, and we established we had no flaps, no brakes, no bombs, and not much fuel. I told the crew to bail out, but they didn't take any notice. They pleaded with me to stay on. I thought they were ruddy fools to do so, but they did. And eventually, when cavorting and twirling didn't alter the position of undercarriages, it would appear we lost all the hydraulic fuel when we selected gear down. And so we had no hydraulic fuel for anything else. So when fuel was nearly ended, we landed on one main wheel. I left it unlocked, it collapsed, and apparently it was quite a fireworks display in that most of the runway was perforated steel, and running along at 100 knots on perforated steel causes quite a fireworks display. I was sitting up the front, nothing to worry about. We managed to keep straight, got up off the end of the runway, and then the old girl broke her back. And I was concerned about my propelling pencil. It was a specialist one, and not only was it an excellent propelling pencil, it had a rubber in one end. Other than that, if you took the rubber out, there were two tiny dice. I never paid dice, but I was fond of showing off my pencil. So when we got to the end in the heat, I ducked down to try and find the dice on the floor. The firemen took an interest in the outfit and thought that I might have needed their assistance. Just as I sat up, they put an axe about there. So I said, "Pray desist," or something of that. And I didn't want to be scalped at that stage. I never did find the dice, but I stepped out of the aircraft, and there it is. But the story doesn't end there. Or next day, the Peggy O'Neill, the chief engineer, handed me the control wheel. He said, "I'm sorry, some buggers pinched the clock already, otherwise I was going to put it in the middle." About 40 years later, I got a letter from Canberra. "Do you know anything about A28-8 J?" And I said, "Yes, I'm familiar with it." And eventually they told me that they planned to bring it out to reconstruct it. And eventually we got word that they were going to bring out 2 American Bostons and mine. The Americans were fairly thick on the ground. They lost 26 due to weather one afternoon. I don't think we lost one. We may have lost one in 12 months due to weather. But they went up there and took their pick of the Yanks, but the Chinook went to US, and they only lifted 1 Yank out. They went in again next year, thinking to take another Yank and my aircraft out. They got another Yank, and mine was still left there. They got bicentennial money and some money from DVA to restore a Boston. So some bright bureaucrats decided nobody knows the difference between a Yank and an Australian. We'll just paint A28-8 on one of these. A corporal. I used to get advice from all sorts of people I'd never met frequently. But the corporal said that they were just going to do this, and I wrote to the minister and said, "Please don't." And a group captain wrote and told me I shouldn't write to the minister. And I don't take advice from group captains, even when I'm in the services. Not always, anyway. But so the story went on, and they spent the money on a Yank to restore it in Richmond and later at Wagga. But eventually they persisted, and I had to write to the minister again and say that the American models were a different model to ours, And blind Freddie would know it wasn't A28-8, and if they didn't know, I'd tell them. So that eventually they went in and they actually, again, it was one of those things. Someone rang me from Port Moresby and said they're going to divert HMAS to Brook to bring out your aircraft. I said, oh, good. So I rang up the OIC Fliers and said, look, can you tell me what the program is for the Chinook to go from Amberley up to pick up my aircraft and put it onto Brook? And they played hard to get, but eventually said they would. A couple of days later they rang up and said, that's top secret, you shouldn't know about it, you must forget about it. Not bloody likely. As fate would have it, and it's one of those quirky things, our only daughter was group travel manager for ANSET in Sydney. And equal opportunities are one thing and another. ANSET was given the right to carry Australian troops. And a couple of her staff specialised in trying to talk the Army, Navy, Air Force into travelling ANSET rather than TAA. And she told one of her blokes, next time you're down at Naval Base headquarters, try and find out the program for dates, HMAS to Brook. And they made a few inquiries and eventually we got the schedule. Ironically, again, perhaps, our daughter showed her disappointment with her employee, Sir Peter Abels, and she eventually, I don't know where she'd get that sort of idea from, but she told Sir Peter what she thought of him and resigned to take effect when convenient. But she found out from her staff member, the Navy, the program for HMAS to Brook, and it coincided with our thoughts of going over to see her as her new position was taking her to Japan. So we were going to Sydney anyway. But it fitted in perfectly to the return of HMAS to Brook. The Navy was very gracious, very kind, and they invited my wife and I, the original Jessica, for dinner on board to greet my old girl. And that was that. Being me, perhaps I tried to twist their arm and I got them to extend the invitation to lunch to my wounded gunner who was now fit and his wife, and to Black Harry, my particular friend, and his wife, all for dinner on to Brook. And that group captain, I think it did met to meet him, perhaps as well, but he rang up and said, HMAS to Brook has been diverted for post-cyclone work in the islands. Its time back in Sydney is unknown. No point in you going to Sydney. And I heard him out, and then I said, HMAS to Brook is tied up alongside Naval Base headquarters in Sydney, and they're expecting me and my party on board for lunch next day. They're ruddy liars. Fabrication. And I'm supposed to write to him directly and not to the minister. So we went to Sydney, and the Navy were very generous and very thoughtful, and we had a nice time. They had arranged for Channel 10 to record the event. I might add, when they first got it yanked down, they had double column, double page recording of it in the RAF News, and they made quite a thought of bringing Boston back to Sydney. With my old girl, the RAF didn't want to hear about it, and the only people that turned up from the RAF, apart from ourselves, ex-RAF, was a semi-trailer and a motor driver late in the afternoon. And as we watched, they took Jessica from HMAS to Brook onto the semi and back to Richmond. The story doesn't end there. They were still persisting with the thought of painting A28-8 J onto a Yank. and it was still persisting with it. So eventually I found out from an anonymous person that Jessica had just been picked up and dumped in a paddock. No attempt to cover it up or inhibit it or anything of that nature. And it had been pressure cleaned and was more vulnerable to deterioration if left in the weather. So I wrote to the minister again. I forgot the group captain's name, I couldn't write to him, and said that as a taxpayer I objected to Tobruk being used and the Chinook being used to bring the old girl back to Australia and just be dumped in a paddock. I didn't get a reply to the letter, but it was undercover within 7 days. And eventually the Chief of Air Staff made it a thought for the 70th anniversary of the formation of the RAF to complete the overhaul or reconstruction of A28-8 Jessica. And the job was transferred from Wagga up to Amberley, and they did a really good job on reconstructing it. In fact, in my view, they wasted hundreds of thousands on it, and got carburetors to go again, and all sorts of things which were not necessary in my view. But we were invited to the rollout in, we were given, oh that's my daughter's in the cockpit and we're standing in the, they thoughtfully provided a cherry picker to get me from the ground up there. But I turned it aside. I was young enough to get in the usual way, and I dismissed the cherry picker. That's daughter and I in the cockpit with the Yank reconstructed one left. Fellow here's Peter Gunson. Peter was the fellow at number 4. He was unscathed in our attack on gas market. He got a DFC for the job. Arsonists aren't considered for that sort of thing. So that that was that. But eventually, the story doesn't stop there. I hope your patience stops. They eventually decided, or the group captain decided, there's no place in the National War Museum for either a Beaufort or a Boston. So it was allocated to the Vintage Aircraft Museum at Point Cook. And it was on its way from Queensland to Point Cook. And they rang me up and said, it's coming down, would you like to talk to someone about it? And I said, oh yes, all right. And I said, you're better off to talk to someone else. I said, you've got my crewman who was badly wounded in it, he lives in Melbourne. Gave him address and phone number. I said, there's another crewman that was with me when I pranged it, and gave them his phone number and address. In the event, no one spoke to anyone, but I got 2 or 3 cuttings from Melbourne. And eventually they said the story was that A28 landed in a swamp in mainland New Guinea. We landed on the airstrip on Goodenough Island. They said, in the official handout, they said the pilot was injured. I was not. In the official handout, they said that the crew walked for 3 days in the jungle before they were rescued. I was picked up in a Land Rover within 10 minutes of coming to a stop. Finally, they said there was a thermos of coffee in the cockpit. I never saw a thermos in New Guinea in the whole time I was there. And eventually I got in touch with the fellow who admitted some responsibility for the press release. Initially he said, oh, you can't be expected to read the truth in press releases and stuff. I said, but you released it. Oh no, I said, well, you published it in full in the RAF News. Oh, yeah. In the end, being me, I suppose I felt a bit kind-hearted. I got him on side, and eventually I said, you know, you missed the best PR bit of the whole bloody lot. You should have admitted that the coffee in the thermos was still hot. And the rather rude fellow, he hung up on me. If you get to Geelong or Point Cook, I've been there, I've tried to tell them the truth, I've given them photographs, and they'll still tell you the story. And my last letter was the Chief of Air Staff asking if I could get a Purple Heart or a pension, or at least trauma counselling. You know, the story they're telling about my problem with Jessica. But the story doesn't end there, of course. I'm still trying. But I've almost given up. I find that even though you write to the Minister or write to the Chief of Air Staff, the chances are bureaucrats will intervene. And if they are in any way involved in the subject matter involved, they see that the offending letter doesn't get to the addressee. But we're still trying.